Good afternoon, everyone. BOMA Greater Dallas is pleased to present this webinar, Reentry to the Workforce, a follow-up to last week's webinar. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to our program. My name is Christine Lang, and I'm your BOMA Greater Dallas president, and I'm also your moderator. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and all participants will be muted during the broadcast. However, you can enter a question during today's presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. If you're listening to the audio only and do not have access to the chat box, submit your questions to cbransford@bomadallas.org, and we will address your questions after the broadcast. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our BOMA Greater Dallas Foundation partners for their support. 5, ABM, Empire Roofing, FSG Facility Solutions Group, Night Restoration Services, Select Commercial Services, Sun Commercial Roof, United Protective Services. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Anthony Barbieri, with Kessler Collins and legal counsel for BOMA Greater Dallas. The goal of the BOMA Greater Dallas Reentry Task Force is to offer information to assist commercial office, medical office, industrial and retail property managers in developing reentry policies for their workforces following the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the lack of scientific information and hard data, this is truly uncharted and unprecedented territory. The information in this webinar is not inclusive and should be treated only as general recommendations and guidance for navigating the reentry process. This information should not be substituted for expert scientific and legal opinions. BOMA Greater Dallas advises its members to consult industry experts and legal counsel before moving forward. Today, Tony will review information from the BOMA Greater Dallas Reentry Task Force, as well as highlights from the governor's report to Open Texas, and questions submitted in advance that you guys provided. So we thank you for that. There were a lot of questions, so apologize in advance if we don't get to it, but we will for sure. So now I'm going to turn over to Tony. Tony, before we get going on the specific questions that our members asked, can you go over the specifics of the governor's report to Open Texas, give a general overview of the report?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Appreciate that. I got to tell you, before I jump into that, it seems like so long ago we were preparing webinars about things closing down, and now here we are, early May, and we're talking about things reopening. So it's been a long road, and I know there's a lot more to go. But to that end, yes. So last Monday, a week ago, Governor Abbott signed a new ordinance, and essentially came out with a plan. He calls it the Governor's Report to Open Texas. And there's a lot to that. It's pretty vast. There's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts to it. And I'll go ahead and try and summarize like the highlights in the overview for you. I will start off by, it's clear that Governor Abbott is looking for a way to not only be mindful of the health and safety of all the citizens, but also the health and safety of all the businesses. It seems like he's really trying to find a balance, strike a balance between the two. And I know that's difficult to do, not only for Governor Abbott, but for all these elected officials on the state and the local and the federal level. So, and as they do that, as they try to strike these balances, sometimes these laws tend to get a little vague, and sometimes there's not a lot of clarity to them. So we'll try and cut through that. The report to Reopen Texas talks about multiple phases of reopen. We are currently in phase 1. Phase 1 started at 12:01 a.m. this past Friday, May 1st. And this phase 1 is set to expire on May 18th. That date may change. I doubt it'll be any earlier, but it may be extended later. I'm not saying it will, but as we've seen this play out throughout our state and the DFW and throughout the country over the past 6 weeks, sometimes these deadlines get pushed out. So currently phase one expires May 18th. We'll talk a little bit more about what's involved specifically in phase one. Specifically, the order requires that every person minimize social gatherings and minimize in-person contact with people that are not in their household. There's a little specificity about what that means in the order, but not a whole lot. The order does say that people over the age of 65 are strongly encouraged to stay at home as much as possible. Now, as a requirement to go from phase one to phase two later on this month, if COVID-19 doesn't spread, the governor's report is going to allow retail stores and other businesses to increase their occupancy to 50%. Right now, it's 25%. We'll get to that more later. And like I said, this could happen as soon as May 18th, or it may be happening at a later date. We don't know yet. Now, the other important thing about the report that Governor Abbott issued last week is there are some very specific guidelines, minimum standards, if you will, for different types of businesses. And these guidelines were put together by industry professionals. The governor took a lot of feedback from folks like all of you listening out there, building owners, building managers. They also took a lot of information from leaders in the retail world, in the restaurant world, hospitality, construction, you name it. And they came out with these guidelines that are specific to industries about what they can do to what they need to do as far as safe practices in their workplace with respect to COVID-19. I'm not going to get into all these right now because they're very, very lengthy. But these are posted on BOMA's website. I know there's been some emails sent to all the membership about where to find this information, and it's actually pretty good information, very good information on BOMA Dallas's website. One thing I would like to point out is that, and this issue came up in a lot of the questions as far as will masks be required or will certain PPE be required. If you look at all the different types of minimum standards for the businesses that the governor's task force put out, there's very specific that all the employees have to be trained on the appropriate amount and type and level of cleaning and disinfectant to use, and all employees need to be trained on the use of all the PPE. We mentioned this in last week's reentry program before we saw these regulations. And BOMA Dallas, when we came up with our recommendations to the governor, we talked about training and implementing and making sure that the workforce is properly trained on how to use all this equipment and how their social distancing is going to work before your individual businesses reenter. The guidelines say that as much as possible, I'm talking about the governor's guidelines here, as much as possible, employees should be screened for symptoms possibly related to COVID-19 before coming into the business. Employees should also maintain at least 6 feet of separation from other individuals. Now, it doesn't say how frequently they should be tested before coming into the business, but that should be as frequent as reasonably possible. The order then goes on to say that if you cannot maintain the 6 foot separation, or if it's just not feasible, then you need to have other measures such as face covering, additional hand hygiene, coughing etiquette, additional cleanliness and sanitation standards need to be rigorously enforced and practiced. So in other words, masks are not necessarily going to be required under governor's report to reopen Texas, but if you can't properly establish this social distancing guidelines in your workplace, then you need to be wearing masks and basically beef up your other cleanliness protocols. The governor's reentry order did not do anything about what have been deemed essential businesses. This is a term that you're probably all familiar with by now. This relates back to the Department of Homeland Security's guidance report that they issued back in the early days of COVID-19, 6 weeks ago. Also, you've seen similar types of definitions of essential services with Clay Jenkins orders and also Governor Abbott's orders. These essential services have not been altered by this new plan to reenter, but there is a very unique feature about this plan. And this feature is to essentially allow for an ad hoc means of businesses to be considered essential. What the governor's order allows is for businesses to go to the Texas Department of Emergency Management's website and or you can email them and you can request that your business can be deemed essential. There's not a lot of guidance so far as to how this is going to work. The TDEMC, the Texas Department of Emergency Management, they have some initial guidelines out there, and they're working to try and clarify that. I've talked to a couple of business owners over the past week who we're working with them to try and get them to be deemed essential. I've actually reached out to some of my favorite businesses in hopes that they deem themselves essential. I may apply to have my gym to become essential as well, but I digress. So anyway, that is a very unique feature of the order, the sort of ad hoc essential business designation. Thank you.
Sorry, I had to find the mute button. Yeah, I think we have a lot of people, a lot of our members and my tenants that are very interested in having their gym open up too.
That's right.
So on to their second question, I just wanted to see, can you summarize the phase one services that are reopening and the restrictions for that?
Yeah, sure. As I briefly mentioned, starting at 12:01 this past Friday, May 1st, retailers, malls, movie theaters, and restaurants can allow people through their doors. In other words, you're not limited to just pick up or take out, but you can have people actually coming into your establishments. But it's limited to only 25% occupancy rate. And it's important to know, and the governor was pretty vociferous about this in his press conference last week. This occupancy rate, if you breach this 25% capacity rule, not only can the proprietor or the owner or the manager of the business be cited for criminal violation, but they could also lose their license to operate that business. So they're taking this very, very seriously. And I've had some discussions with clients and with landlords about how do we determine this. Certainly, if you had a shop that's very small, in a retail strip center, you can count the number of people that walk in and out of your door. But if you have multiple locations, how do you actually control the capacity? I know, for example, in an effort to do this, North Park Mall, they've limited entry to only the main doors on Northwest Highway and Park, in an effort to help count and help control the number of people going in and out of that establishment. But this is going to be key to be able to police this for a number of reasons. One is because of the health and safety issues, and to maintain social distancing, but also so that you don't find yourself in criminal liability or find yourself in a situation where you've lost your right to conduct business. I will say that I have had some clients ask me they don't know what their actual occupancy rate is, and so I said, well, you need to find that out first, because otherwise, you could be in big trouble. And so we've had some calls with local code enforcement and fire marshals to figure out what the capacity is for each business. So you need to understand what that is if you are in fact one of these retailers or retail establishments that are allowed to reenter. I do want to point out, this is not necessarily a situation that's going to arise here in the Metroplex of the 4 major counties in the Metroplex, but with counties throughout Texas that have less than 5 cases of COVID-19 that are reported on or after April 30. So long as that statistic is verified by the Texas Department of State Health Services, those establishments can increase their occupancy to up to 50% for restaurants, retail shops, shopping malls, museums, etc. Also movie theaters. So that may, like I said, that's probably not going to be an issue definitely here in Dallas, Tarrant, Denton, or Collin counties. But I say this because some people might have friends or family in smaller counties throughout Texas, and they might be hearing about 50%, and there might be some confusion about 50 versus 25. Again, to clarify, in-store retail services are permitted for all retail establishments up to 25%. Churches and places of religious worship are allowed to open for regular services. There are some strict social distancing protocols that are actually, the language is a little vague on whether or not it's required or just strongly encouraged, but they're asking people to sit at least 6 feet from everybody and have at least 2 seats between you and the next person that you're sitting with at your church or place of religious worship. And then if you're with someone that you live with, you can sit next to them, but you have to have 6 feet of distance between you and everybody else, not only on either side, but front to back. I know that a lot of churches are trying to figure out how they're going to do this. I know that some churches, I was reading this over the weekend, the Roman Catholic Diocese here in Dallas, they're looking at only having certain services come back online right now, and looking to in the next couple weeks or maybe longer open up full Sunday services given the capacity requirements. So you're going to have to definitely check with your local church or place of worship before you just start barging on in there. Like I said, restaurants can have dine-in services, but there are a lot of restrictions on restaurants in addition to the 25% capacity rule. If anyone went out to eat over the weekend, you probably saw this, but parties at restaurants have to have at least 6 feet of distance between that party and all the other parties in the restaurant. Obviously, if you're sitting at a table with your own party, you don't have to socially distance from them, but you have to socially distance from everybody else in the restaurant. And this includes while you're waiting to be seated. So if you're sitting in the lobby or in the bar area waiting to have a seat at your table, you have to maintain this 6-foot rule with other parties. Restaurants are not allowed to sit tables with more than 6 people. They have to have disposable menus for each new customer. They can only have condiments available upon request and only in single-use portions. So if you want a bottle of ketchup or whatever, they're not going to bring that to you. They'll have to bring it to you in a little cup, a little portion. Buffets are allowed, but only if the employee serves the food to the customer. The customers cannot go up and grab the food off the buffet. Bars have to remain closed even if they serve food. The distinction here is if a bar has more than 51% of their sales from alcohol, then they're considered a bar for this order, and they cannot remain open. Movie theaters are allowed to open with the same 25% capacity. Their social distancing guidelines are really similar to what I just described for churches. And again, malls can reopen with 25% capacity requirement. However, food courts, play areas, any interactive displays and interactive types of settings have to be closed during this phase 1. There is also some language in the governor's order that's a little strange, a little vague, I should say. It says that places like public swimming pools, gyms, bars, salons, massage places, and places like bowling alleys, video games are not encouraged to be visited and will remain closed. But the verbiage is a little strange because it doesn't exactly, it says that they're going to be closed, but then it says that we recommend you don't go there, which is odd to me because if they're closed, then you shouldn't be going there. There's no way for you to go there. But again, it's just a little vagueness in the code.
Okay. Well, thank you for summarizing the phase 1. Now on to our specific questions that our members asked us. What is your building's anticipated timing for the reentry process?
Well, that's a good question. Our firm's main headquarters, we're down at 2100 Ross Avenue, and I would like to say that they were ready for reentry right away. I got to tell you, we had a bunch of questions for them, and they were very responsive to us, and they were very responsive as far as getting the signage in place, getting extra hand sanitizer. And so our building is open, and that's good news. Of course, our building never closed, so let me clarify that. But they're ready for the reentry, and they've been pretty good working with property management down there. Very happy about that. I will say that in talking with various other clients and other folks in the industry, like a lot of the office buildings are going to be open probably this week or within the next few days if they're not already set for reentry. I think that some of the retail folks I've talked to are having a little bit of a struggle with this. Some open up right away. Others are taking a little longer to open back up again, either because they don't have the proper PPE, they don't have the proper training in place, or they are having a hard time with the capacity requirements and making sure they follow the guidelines. And so I think those folks are going to start coming online, it's hard to say, but probably within the next 10 days or so is kind of what I'm hearing. Again, this is not scientific data here. This is just kind of a sense I'm getting from talking to a lot of other folks in the industry and clients and people that are on these task force. I will say that it seems to be like the industrial folks and the medical office folks seem to have also gotten a hold of the reentry pretty early on, and they seem to be ready to roll as well.
Okay. Are buildings opening to everyone at once?
Well, this is kind of really a question. We kept it in here because I wanted to really draw a distinction. There have been a lot of laws over the past several weeks dealing with COVID-19 and shelter in place, but none of these laws actually physically closed buildings. The laws were intended to allow certain essential businesses to stay open and other businesses to not open if they're not essential. The laws never shut down the buildings. So we need to be careful when we talk to our tenants and our vendors about reopening, because that's is actually not accurate, because the buildings never actually closed, unless now some buildings here and there may have closed for a specific reason, but there have been no laws requiring a building to close. And what I want to be mindful of is as tenants start waking up and coming back to your buildings, I don't want messages being out there saying, "Hey, we are now reopening," because that may lead some tenants to believe that they were not open the whole time. And I've seen already where some tenants are saying, "Well, if you guys were closed, then why was I paying rent since mid-March?" So this is the word open. I think we all know what that means, but when you use that to some tenants who are trying to take advantage of the situation, we've seen some folks that are trying to say that to twist those words and say that you haven't actually been open. Anyway, that was kind of an aside, but to answer your question, as far as buildings actually staying open, we have had some that have had a hard time getting, like I said, getting proper PPE. And so we have seen some folks delay their official reentry, but I haven't seen anybody that, like you said, are not going to actually open.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely terminology, reopen to reentry is huge. So in your building, are they requiring masks for tenants and vendors?
Well, the buildings themselves are, I have not talked to anyone or heard anyone require a mask for a specific tenant. I have had a lot of tenants tell me, and I've had a lot of property managers tell me that they want all their vendors to have masks and have their vendors wear PPE. And that I understand, but I haven't seen any property managers or any owners require their tenants to wear masks. Now, I will say that we have seen a lot of buildings be proactive and recommend that their tenants follow proper social distancing and wear masks and use PPE. I haven't seen anybody actually require it. Although, as we talked about a few minutes ago, if a business, let's say a restaurant or retail establishment, if they can't maintain the social distancing guidelines, then they are going to have to start wearing masks and stepping up their sanitation and hygiene, their cleanliness of themselves. So to the extent that a business is not able to have this proper social distancing, they will have to start wearing masks. But I have not yet seen a landlord require that.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing at the Crescent is we're recommending, big word there, recommending as of May 1st. So
yep. Yeah, that's good. That's a good practice. Yes,
definitely. Are office buildings opening in stages with specific occupancy allowed?
I've had this question come up quite a bit, and very long story short, from a legal perspective, it's very difficult to recommend that you tell your tenants when they can and cannot open or come back into the building, because that alone could be a breach of your lease. If you don't have the legal right to make them open back up in stages, then that could be a breach of your lease. Now, so I really want to caution against doing that. What I have seen, and I think this is a good idea, in an effort to practice good social distancing in your buildings, and where there's places in your building where there are queues, for example, elevators are probably the best way to look at this. We're seeing a lot of property managers reach out to their tenants, especially the bigger tenants, and ask them if they would consider, again, this is not a requirement, this is a request, that they consider having staged shifts throughout the day. So for example, if you have a building that that has, let's say, 10 major tenants, and they all start work at 8 a.m., we've seen a lot of property managers ask if those tenants would consider having a shift at, let's say, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Likewise, those folks would leave, they would leave at 4, 5, and 6, as opposed to coming in at 8, leaving at 5. And that's one way of just helping to reduce the number of people standing in line waiting for an elevator, because they have to practice social distancing, not only while they wait in line for the elevator, but while they're in the elevator. So like I said, I haven't seen any property managers require that they do that, but that's definitely been something that's been suggested for a lot of tenants to participate in.
Okay. Have you seen our management companies setting the guidelines for PPE use, or is that being left up to the tenants to enforce with their workers?
We're getting a lot of requests for that. A lot of tenants are reaching out to their property management teams and asking for these specific guidelines, and that's some of those requests have been coming back to me, and I'm telling my clients I would not go out and recommend to them which PPE to use or how to use it. I say this for a number of reasons. One, every business is slightly different, and in order for you to be an expert in what proper PPE usage that business has, you really need to not only know about the law, you need to know about the public health and safety aspects of that business, but you also need to understand how that business operates on a day-to-day basis. Unless you're qualified for all three of those, and I don't think any property manager is or needs to be, you should not be in a position of recommending how they use or implement PPE. Instead of doing that, and I say that because not only could you be creating legal liability for yourself by recommending something that you don't have proper knowledge to recommend, but you could also be creating a health and safety issue if your recommendation is not correct. So I would definitely not go out on that limb. This is something that frankly each business needs to consult not only their legal team, but they need to also, to the extent necessary, consult a professional as far as cleaning and hygiene and what other PPE to use for their specific business.
That's interesting. The number one question, how can we get tenants to cooperate with the new protocols?
Well, yeah, this is a good question, and certainly I think we've had this discussion, frankly, amongst our firms, how we're going to get our own employees to cooperate, much less how do you get your tenants to cooperate. So I think a couple things to keep in mind. Depending on who your tenants are, they're going to have to follow certain requirements. If they're in the retail world, we just discussed this, how that's supposed to work. So you need to be mindful that pretty much all of your leases require your tenants to follow the law. Okay. So depending on your type of tenant, they're going to have a law. They're going to have to follow some law or some protocol for reentry. Okay. And so to the extent you need to remind them, either gently or less than gently, that they need to comply with the law, you can certainly do that. And we've had situations before I'm talking about the past couple of weeks, where my clients have asked our firm to reach out to specific tenants to remind them that they have to comply with the law. And generally speaking, these tenants, had mixed reactions to it. Some complied right away. Some didn't realize they were violating the law. Some were a little reluctant to comply, and some complied for a little bit and then stopped complying. So it just depends on your tenants. I think you're going to find that your better tenants, the tenants that were not well at behaving prior to this, are probably not going to change. So I don't know. Good luck handling that. But for those tenants but there are a lot of tenants who just don't understand how this is supposed to work. And so those are the tenants we need to focus on. So I would say remind them that they have to comply with the law. Also, you might want to consider that most of your leases will allow you to enact rules and regulations from time to time. And so this might be a good opportunity for you to to amend your building's rules and regulations if you want to implement certain social distancing requirements or hygiene requirements. Just be careful that the rules that you enact do not change the lease. In other words, most leases state that to the extent the landlord revises those rules, they cannot conflict with the original terms of the lease. So for example, if your tenant is permitted to occupy their space 24/7, and you have a rule that says that you now can only have your staff come in from 7 a.m. till 4 p.m., that rule could definitely be a violation of your lease. So before you start doing that, you gotta check your lease.
Okay. So the next question I've received this a lot from my tenants is, but how do you think we can help our tenants find supplies while we're looking for them too?
Well, this has been a tough question because everyone. This harkens back to mid-March when everyone was scrounging around for toilet paper, and right. But now everyone's scrounging around for masks and bandanas and gloves, and they're very hard to find. I don't know that, for a couple of things. I don't know as property managers that we have any more specific insight to this than our tenants. So I don't know that we are really that good at resources for them. So the other thing to keep in mind is some people are looking for certain types of thermometers or test kits to test people for COVID-19, and you have to be careful with that because some of this equipment doesn't work very well. It's not very accurate, and what you don't want to do is go out on a limb and recommend something to a tenant only to realize that what you recommended didn't work because it was defective. And so you got to be really careful about doing that. And I'm telling my property managers when they ask me, that they're going to have to go out and be as resourceful as everybody else is, and figure it out. Not to put you on the spot, Christine, what are you telling your tenants who are asking you?
Well, we're just kind of telling them the same thing, like we're having problems too, but we're just trying to get on the wait list, and finally we're able to get some hand sanitizers recently, and we're trying to just think of different, not just your original vendors. There's other vendors that we're able to find, so kind of just giving them options of, here's who I've heard of, but also they're coming back to me with some of who they're using too. So it's been kind of pretty helpful.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah. Going both ways there.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, that's, those are all the questions that we had from so far. I don't know if there's been any since we started.
Well, we did have one question. For how long should landlords provide rent relief to tenants?
This is good question. I think that it really depends on the tenant. I think that certainly you have to look at the tenant and figure out what's going on with them holistically. What do they have going for them? Or do they have, for example, a restaurant tenant might have a lot more problems than, let's say, an accounting firm. And so you really need to look at each tenant individually and see what they're going through and what their specific financial situation is. Also, now there's been 2 rounds of funding by the federal government for a lot of the PPP loans. In addition to the PPP loan program, there's also a Main Street loan program. By the way, you can get a PPP loan and a Main Street loan. If you qualify for both, you can certainly get both. And so I'm having a lot of discussions with tenants who are coming to landlords for relief, and they haven't even bothered to go out and try and get some of these loans, and these tenants are probably qualified to do it. So I would say that if the tenant is somebody who just has no means of getting any further rent, any further financial assistance, if they can't go to bank and get a conventional loan, if they don't have owners that can pony up more money, and if you think that tenant could be viable, a viable tenant, if they can get through this, you may want to consider giving that tenant some rent relief. But it's a tough decision to answer in the abstract because it really depends on each specific tenant.
Definitely. Well, I don't see any other questions here. So I thank you, Tony, for that follow-up on everything. That was so informative. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for everyone who submitted the questions. If you'd like additional information, BOMA International has published their reentry guidelines as well, and you can find that document on the COVID-19 resources page on the BOMA Greater Dallas website. Our next webinar will be this Friday, May 8th, and we'll cover how vendors can be a resource. Information for this webinar can be found on the BOMA Greater Dallas website under event calendar. Many thanks to our BOMA Greater Dallas Foundation partners for their support. 5, ABM, Empire Roofing, FSG Facility Solutions Group, Night Restoration Services, Select Commercial Services, Sun Commercial Roofs, and United Protective Services. Thank you guys and have a great one. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.